Hundreds of New York City police officers in riot gear moving into Columbia University. SWAT teams rolling in. One by one, police officers seen filing in on an extended ramp into the second floor of Columbia's Hamilton Hall. In the late night hours, police forming a line around the perimeter, clearing protesters blocking the entrance. Once inside, going floor by floor, room by room. NYPD using flashbangs. At least 100 people arrested, led away, hands tied behind their backs with zip ties.
Well, as you can see from that footage, Columbia University's president, Manoush Shafiq, gave hundreds of NYPD officers the green light to storm Hamilton Hall and arrest demonstrators who had broken into and occupied the building. The building's occupation came after Columbia's administration began suspending demonstrators without due process, of course, demanding that the peaceful pro-Palestine encampment be dismantled. That was when some demonstrators, who organizers referred to as an autonomous group, broke into Hamilton Hall.
Columbia administration now telling students and faculty to avoid campus and warning that access to other buildings may be restricted. Columbia had started suspending students who remained in the pro-Palestine encampment outside there past Monday afternoon. Some of them had been leaving. But shortly after midnight, a student smashed a window of Hamilton Hall with a hammer. The group Columbia Students for Justice in Palestine says that dozens have barricaded themselves inside Hamilton Hall. You can see them here in these images, using furniture and other objects to blockade the doors.
The people who were already inside Hamilton Hall decided to smash the windows and then put bike locks like around each door handle.
And look, I don't want to completely minimize what some people experienced during the occupation of the building. Right-wing media has been playing this one instance over and over again involving a custodial worker within the building who claimed that he was held hostage. He was let go and released from the building within 10 minutes. But nonetheless, those are the types of instances that have been cited over and over again to kind of paint a picture of these protesters being super dangerous. Columbia has received the bulk of media attention, mostly due to the fact that their administrators bungled things from day one, which sparked more protests on campuses across the country.
Pausing here to deliver some honest truth as we do in our news coverage as well. TYT is facing challenges, guys, as the entire industry is. You know who could make the difference? You. If you hit the join button below, it's gonna make all the difference and keep us in business. We appreciate you, thank you.
Things didn't need to devolve into violence. Manoush Shafiq's decision to get police involved and break up the encampment led to an escalation. And look, don't take it from me, take it from Columbia University professor Marianne Hirsch.
We do not want police to be entering our campus. We think this is putting the entire campus community and the neighborhood in Columbia, where I live, at tremendous risk to bring police in riot gear. I think there are many different ways that this could have been resolved with further negotiation. It did not have to be done at this speed.
How would you have liked to have seen it handled?
Well, there's professional mediation, there's further negotiations. We've seen building occupation and student protests over the history of education since perhaps 1968 and maybe before that. And there are ways to resolve this with mediations and some patience.
Yeah, right. But finding a nonviolent way to resolve the issue takes time, patience, effort. It's much easier to just call the cops and have them dismantle a peaceful encampment, which doesn't really solve anything. This unrest doesn't simply dissipate when protesters are met with police force. There needs to be a resolution. And Professor Hirsch is also right about students occupying buildings on campus as a form of protest for many, many decades. In fact, in April of 1968, hundreds of Columbia students seized Hamilton Hall in protest of the Vietnam War, specifically the university's involvement in research for weapons of war. Let me just be clear about that. So it had to do with some funding related matters. They also were protesting racism. Now, similar to what just happened at Columbia, students back in the 1960s barricaded themselves inside the building. But the protesters of decades past went further. than that by literally preventing Henry Coleman, the acting dean at the time, from leaving his office for a full night. They even used furniture to trap him in his office. And I want to be clear, I am not advocating for people to do that. But it is important to differentiate the intensity of those protests in 1968 versus what happened on Columbia's campus recently. And by the way, in regard to the occupation of Hamilton Hall back in 1968, a week later, the police entered the building through underground tunnels, which seems to be a reoccurring theme when it comes to stories involving Israel and, Gaza. But nonetheless, underground tunnels and cleared the students. Police officers trampled protesters, hit them with nightsticks, and dragged some down concrete steps. More than 700 people were arrested. And look, if you can believe it, the school back then actually had more patience with the demonstrators than what we just witnessed at Columbia's campus. Democracy Now!'s Juan Gonzalez was actually one of the student protesters in 1968, and he reflects on the differences between then and now.
I think what is really unusual about this process is that here the university moved in very quickly, and also these students were not disrupting classes. We occupied buildings. We did not allow classes to go forward in 1968, but classes were going forward. The students were camped out peacefully on the lawn. So the disproportionate nature of the response of the university, the quickness with which it responded without even consulting or listening to the faculty is really astounding. And the other aspect of it is that when we were suspended, and there were many of us suspended, before we were suspended, we were allowed to appear before a tribunal to plead our cause. There was at least the rudiments of due process. Here, there is no due process. The university is already within 24 hours saying that the students are suspended, even though there is yet no legal proof that any of these students knowingly participated in illegal actions.
Look, my personal belief is that Manoush Shafiq is terrified that she'll be forced to resign. And so she wants to lay down the law and act aggressively against the protesters, hoping that it will somehow save her job by placating right-wingers who are already calling for her to resign. And while Columbia is unwilling to move on the divestment demands that are driving these campus protests, there is another college that has taken a different and more admirable approach.
Brown University announced today it will vote on divestment this fall.
What Brown has agreed to do is have the Brown Corporation vote on effectively a proposal that's based on a 2020 proposal that called for the divestment from just 11 companies. Those 11 companies would be divested from part of the direct investments of Brown University, which accounts for less than 10% of Brown's entire endowment. Columbia is saying we're not going to engage in that right now. We need to see what the situation is over the next weeks and months before we even have this conversation. And candidly, we need to have a graduation. So it's two different approaches. Part of the reason why Brown may be interested in having this conversation is because of how narrow the approach is. When we look at these encampments across the country, what we're seeing is students are asking for divesting from three different areas: weapons manufacturers, businesses in Israel, and businesses that do business with Israel. Brown's just looking at 11 institutions.
So in other words, the students at Brown definitely had a more specific and narrow demand, and that strategy has seemed to be pretty fruitful. Although we should wait and see how the Brown Corporation votes in the fall. However, because of the fact that they're willing to take a vote in the first place on divesting from those 11 companies, student protesters at Brown have been dismantling their encampment. No violence, no police involved. By the way, I should also note a second university has agreed to consider divesting from some companies that they're invested in tied to Israel, and that's Northwestern. Now, Columbia's students had broader demands, which are articulated by one of the student protesters here.
My name is Soida Pawat. I'm a student organizer. I'm a graduate student at Columbia University. I study human rights here. I'm also part of the negotiating team.
And if you could tell us, what is it exactly you're demanding?
Simple. We don't want to trade in the blood of Palestinians, and that means divestment from all direct and indirect holders holdings that this university has, whether that be weapons manufacturing, companies that operate illegally in occupied territory, companies that produce information technology for the occupation army, complete divestment. We're also requesting disclosure. We don't have transparency on this university's investments, and we need that to be able to push the movement further. We're also requesting amnesty. Hundreds of our students have been disciplined over the past 6 months on unfair premises.
So clearly Columbia's students had broader goals, which is both admirable and admittedly harder to accomplish. The way these investments work can be pretty tricky as well, especially when you're referring to indirect divestment. Let's watch.
The vast majority of university endowment funds are not invested in direct stocks like stock pickers. We're not running E-Trade accounts as endowment managers. What they're doing is investing in hedge funds or private equity. And oftentimes with the vast majority of institutions, they're looking at index funds. Now, that's a lot of different businesses packaged in these funds, and it's difficult to know at any given time what those businesses are doing. The way I'd like to think about it is you may invest in, say, Pepsi, but not know that Pepsi is about to buy SodaStream, an Israeli company, as they did in 2017. If an endowment manager wanted to completely divest from Israel, that would mean once that deal is closed, divesting from Pepsi altogether. And there just aren't index funds that have that ability to move quickly and that complete knowledge of how deeply tied companies are to the Israeli case.
Now, look, I'm not here trying to dictate the way in which these protesters craft their demands against their university or toward their university. I'm just trying to be helpful and show the differences because I want these students to accomplish what they're attempting to accomplish here. And maybe protesters can learn from the success that Brown students have had and recalibrate future demands that might be a little more easy to accomplish. But to be clear, we're not even sure what Columbia's endowment is invested in because the administration decided against being transparent with the students, which of course, as you heard from the student earlier, is something that the pro-Palestinian protesters want to change. That's one of their demands. Overall, more than 300 students were arrested last night during police raids at Columbia and City College of New York. Those with power can arrest the protesters, sure, but you can't arrest ideas and you can't ignore the immorality of funding Israel's brutal war on Gazans. More than 33,000 people have been killed in this tiny enclave, with 2/3 of the deceased consisting of women and children. As more than 1 million displaced Palestinians shelter in the southern border town of Rafah, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared yesterday that he intends to carry out a ground invasion despite the resulting civilian casualties and regardless of whether a ceasefire deal is reached, which clearly means he himself isn't a good faith actor and is a massive obstacle to any ceasefire resolution. It says something about our country and its power players when they'd rather crack the skulls of American citizens, of students, as they assemble in protest, rather than question whether giving Israel military support with no strings attached, with no conditions, makes any sense. Just yesterday, Israeli National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, someone I wish I never had to think about, called for executing Palestinians held captive to alleviate overcrowding in prisons. Mind you, a lot of these people never even had any due process. Anyway, the Israeli Defense Forces Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi, briefed ministers at a security cabinet meeting last week about recent operations in Gaza. During the briefing, he said that hundreds of Palestinians were recently arrested after surrendering to the military. Now, in response, Ben-Gvir asked, quote, "Why are there so many arrests? Can't you kill some? Do you want to tell me they all surrender? What are we to do with so many arrested? It's dangerous for the soldiers." Okay, now I don't want to lump in all Israeli government members as the same evil type of person that Ben-Gvir is, because luckily, he did receive pushback after he made that statement. Halevi was perplexed at the question, according to the Times of Israel, responding, dangerous for who? We don't shoot people who come out with their hands up. We shoot those who fight us, the IDF official reportedly told Ben-Gvir. There's no dilemma here. Those who surrender, we arrest. But it seems like Ben-Gvir is committed to just executing Palestinian captives or Palestinians in general. That wasn't the first time Ben-Gvir called for executing Palestinian captives. Earlier this month, the minister posted on social media that applying the death penalty to some captives would help address the issue of prison overcrowding. The comment came after his proposal to build nearly 1,000 additional prison places for Palestinian captives was approved. In February, Ben-Gvir also called for the IDF to shoot Palestinian women and children, mission accomplished, in Gaza in order to protect the troops. There cannot be a situation in which children and women approach us from the wall, he told Halevi, according to Israeli media. Anyone who approaches in order to harm security must receive a bullet. Otherwise, we will see October 7th again. If you're concerned about the possibility of October 7th happening again, maybe bolster security a little bit. Maybe don't have all the IDF soldiers guarding illegal settlements in the West Bank. Maybe fortify your border. Something that they failed to do when October 7th occurred. Never takes any responsibility for their failures, right? And by the way, maybe we should focus on the root of the problem, which is the endless death and destruction carried out by Israel's far-right government. This is the violence that the United States supports so much that they bankroll it. That's the violence that student protesters were trying to put an end to, whether the media wants to validate them or not. And one final thing that I'll say is, if you have a problem with people not wanting their hard-earned money to be funneled to a foreign government so they can carry out a brutal war, a war that has many examples of international laws being broken, war crimes being committed, I think there's a bigger problem with you. The entitlement of us sending money to Israel blows my mind, of us being invested in Israeli companies that are tied to this war, is insane to me. If you find it totally moral to funnel your money over to Israel, great. But don't start cracking skulls of American citizens who do have a problem with that, who do find that immoral and want to make their voices heard. That's what was happening on college campuses. I think that this effort to squash the protests is gonna fail, and I think that there's gonna be more unrest moving forward because there hasn't really been a resolution. But it is amazing to me that rather than just being patient, seeing if negotiations can continue, Colombia decides to dismantle that encampment, and that's what led to an escalation of violence. That's what led to the occupation of that building. We could learn lessons from this, but of course we won't.
If you enjoyed this video, that's because of our members. They make us independent, they make us strong, and they make us honest. Become a member today by hitting the join button below.